Hello, this is the Coach Support Show where science meets strategy. And the first thing we're going to talk about today is structure, how to be structured as a coach. Now, when I was first starting to work with other coaches, I met with, I don't know, over a month period, maybe 30, 40 plus coaches from all over the place in esports who wanted to potentially work on their coaching, develop their own coaching. And when I asked them to describe how they are as a coach, structured is the thing that came back the absolute most. However, I think when we look at practical examples, often with these same people who are describing themselves as structured, it's not really a word that necessarily comes to mind for me. So, Watson, what does being structured mean to you as a coach?
So it's fascinating to hear, you've come across it a lot. It's one of the most sort of demanded topics in your development work. It's same for me. I think talking to people, aspiring coaches, they like to think that, not they like to think, but they often would like to feel that that's an area they can improve, but they're already reasonably good at. They see it as quite important to being a coach. And I think for me, just on the outset, it's something you see a lot of synonyms for in coaching. So people might describe themselves as structured, yes, but it might also mean organized. It might mean professional. It might mean something around systems and building systems, and maybe later we might get into things like routines. I think there is some commonality across that. Of course, there are lots of differences, but yeah, the way I see it in practice is that somebody might consider themselves to be organized, might be like the common thread there. But I think structure, at least if you look into the coaching literature in sport, and again, the huge caveat in most of what I say is it comes from the depth and breadth of research in sport, and it hasn't really been studied extensively in esports. But from the coaching perspective, you could imagine there are some similarities there. And there are different ways of thinking about structure and looking at structure and what structures are implemented through our coaching. And it's just a fascinating thing to think about because, yeah, not the most emotionally charged, exciting term. And if you really think about it, like a basic structure could be a house. So it seems to be something quite physical, tangible, and like obvious. But there are subtleties to it. I think there are different ways of thinking about it, and so maybe some gray area that we can maybe clarify a little bit today.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I like that kind of
yeah,
thing of organization. I think all of those words are slightly different, at least to me.
yeah,
But maybe the process one being the most similar, and it's almost like if the structure is the house, the processes are the bricks. So you need one to build into the other.
hmm
But I would ask, in a sense, isn't a huge majority, if not arguably, basically everything you do as a coach is to provide structure to the team?
interesting. We should explore that. So yeah, I won't. Let me. I'll bite my tongue for a second. Go into that a bit more. How do you
Hmm.
mean?
Well, to be honest, I hadn't thought about it till right now, as you said it.
So you're stepping into a team. You're there in your words almost to provide something,
Yeah,
and that would be.
I think that in esports, especially in higher level teams, again, especially with higher level players who are more experienced, who know the game very well, in a situation like we have in esports, where a lot of times the coaches, they might know the kind of macro game better, the team game, but they don't know more about the game. It's not like you're there as a coach because you're now, you were a player for 20 years and then you were also studying coaching and all this kind of thing, and you're far older or whatever. This game is new and we don't have an advantage from having, than the players. um I think a huge percentage of your job can be just providing that structure so that the players can like fill in the details, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So I do think it depends on the roster that you're with. But for example, with Nord, there's unbelievably experienced players who are, you know, far more experienced than the kind of tournament that we're in and the sort of level that we're in. And a big part of my job is just providing a structure for them and getting them on the same page and getting, each one to help each other, kind of thing. So less me doing stuff and more me providing the space for them to do things. And so potentially a big part of my job, a big percentage of my job is just that structure around like what are we going to look at today? What direction are we going to go? What is going to be the goal? Who is going to be doing what? Those kind of things, where it's not like I'm telling them to do this thing. It's more like I'm setting up a structure around it. But it wasn't something I thought about until right this second. I mean, I always do say it's a big part of what I think I'm good at as a coach, so I do lean into it more than others. But I think as well, the higher up you go in something like League of Legends, the less players need the things that aren't structure, and the more the structure things matter as a coach.
Yeah. So this is really interesting because in the answer you just gave, you gave some like big coaching topics, which each one could be a podcast on itself. So you spoke about being on the same page. You spoke about providing direction. You spoke about setting goals. You spoke about you didn't use the word, but you spoke about ensuring sort of role clarity. So talking about roles. You spoke about what I might call, and borrowing from research here, orchestrating. So sort of like pulling certain strings to get the ship heading in certain directions. And I think if you asked a grassroots coach in most sports, and maybe esports too, what is structure, they might start with, it's telling players when they're going to turn up to train during the week, and it's saying maybe what the practice is going to look like, what the scrim is going to look like. So in sports slightly easier, you might say we're going to do our traditional 10-minute warm-up, we're going to do a bit of part practice, we're going to do a bit of game-like practice, and then a cool down, right? So that could be, I think, at a grassroots sport level, what we might talk about as structure. What you've spoken about there, it's maybe slightly less tangible, for want of a better word. So talking about getting players on the same page through the sports psychology lens, you're going to be talking about task cohesion, social cohesion, so building relationships, building understanding of what people are trying to do and how they would do it together. And I think those are things that you can be structured in your approach to doing it, but it might not be such a tangible or a strong connection to what the average esports coach might think about as structure, which I think is a testament to your level of coaching, and also the complexity of the term, because it captures that too. So it's a lot to unpack it in using that term, and it kind of makes sense in all those contexts. To maybe delve into one of the ones you picked up on there that I think is really strong. Let's move beyond the organizational structure of we're going to train or we're going to scrim 3 days a week and we're going to have 2 nights of officials. Like, let's move away from that. Let's say that's kind of a given. It's like it is structure in some respects, but let's say it's more organizational and scheduling, and that's kind of set. Moving more towards a sort of more abstract would be the idea of goals, which you spoke about. And this is where I see a really low-hanging fruit in terms of improving coaching in esports, where we can borrow straight from some strong coaching literature around distinguishing between longer-term goals and shorter-term goals, and some alignment between them. And you can think about it as a structure. So it's what might be called a nested structure, or nested planning, or nested thinking. And you're essentially saying to yourself, well, what is my goal, my plan right now for this team over the long term? And maybe in league, for a head coach, it's reasonable to think about a year. And then that could be our, what might be called macro level thinking, or macro level planning. And then we can go right down to what we're going to be doing on a day-to-day that might reflect that. And in the middle there's a meso level planning level, which will kind of be like what are intermediary steps between what I do on a day-to-day and what my overarching objective is. And that is, in the sports coaching literature, one example of working from structure.
And does this come from the head coach, you think? Because I think one of the problems about talking about structure kind of more, I don't want to say more seriously, that sounds terrible, but talking about it in this kind of context where we're starting to bring in literature, starting to bring in actually, okay, what are some structures that we could use to base it off, all those kind of things. The problem with that is that if no structure exists around the team, then it's quite difficult for that structure to come from the head coach. So, for example, one of the things that I am very critical of, or have been very critical of, sometimes openly, but always, always privately, is the way that academy teams have been used in the past. Now, actually, this year, several big ones are changing in a kind of quite public way around what they're actually doing and the actual structure that they're doing, and the goal of that academy. But if you're a coach coming into one of those situations and you're only there for a year, then you don't really get to decide what the goal is for that year, because it doesn't matter what you're told. The goal is for that year is to do as well as possible in summer, because you're going to go look for another job, and where you placed is the only thing that will matter. So you don't get to decide the macro stuff already. So is there even I think this stuff is incredibly useful. I think it's incredibly important, but I think it needs to come from this position that I still think doesn't really exist in esports, where someone who could actually think about the long-term idea. And I think that if we're talking about like macro, meso, and micro, the downside is that in a very competitive industry like we have in esports, your macro thinking can't be the same length as your contract, for me, in practice, because it's almost decided what you need for the end of the contract. What you really need is your best going into the off season in the best position possible, which as a coach is with the best result. Therefore, the macro goal is kind of decided already. So do you think this is something that coaches should be focused on, or is it actually something, well, maybe it's just both, everyone should be aware of it, or what do you reckon?
Well, dream thinking would be, don't walk into a coaching job when it doesn't align with who you see yourself as a coach. So if you it's easier in sport because we have more defined levels of coaching. So we have the sort of recreational coach, participation coach, we have the developmental coach, we have the elite coach, like performance level stuff. It's a bit more lumped together in esports, where if you're coaching an academy team, it's unclear, I think, at present whether you're actually an academy coach or if you're an aspiring elite coach and you're just using it as a stepping stone. So do you have skills that are perfect for developing players, in which case you're an excellent academy coach, or are you just looking at it as like an opportunity, a shot to get to the next level? So that's where it's a bit blurred. But I would say don't take the job if the org has told you outright that this is an academy team, the goal is just to win, and you don't believe in that. Like, that's when I would say, red flag, don't take the job.
Two things. Firstly, I don't think orgs say that. They say the goal is to develop players and you're here for a year. And what people need to realize is that means the goal is not to develop players.
Right.
Because no one looks at a coach at the end of the year and say, yeah, you might have come 9th and then 10th, but one of the players did go up to the main team.
Yeah.
You came 9th and 10th. You go off into the off season because your contract was only a year, and you're screwed because you came last, and that's all people look at. Like, that's at least 90% of what people look at. Just like, what are your recent results? Now, of course, maybe in future that would be something that will change. And the other thing I think that needs to change eventually, you mentioned there, like maybe you're an academy focused coach. I don't think that there's anyone who would I think there might be people who would describe themselves like that, but I don't think there is anyone who would want to describe themselves like that in esports. In the same way as I think I've mentioned before, someone who is now a head coach in the LEC once told me, no, like he said, every single assistant coach wants to be a head coach, and like genuinely believes that. And I think, to be honest, in esports, he might well be right, because we don't actually see two different roles. We just see a structure, we just see a hierarchy, and we just see, right, well, we want to be further up the structure, even though there's plenty of people who are much better doing the things that an assistant coach probably should do, and there are people who are much better doing the things that the head coach should do, and they probably should be paid less than that assistant coach who
Yeah.
who might bring more value to the team. So I think there's two things I think that are interesting that need to change. Is firstly, the org might say we're interested in developing talent. Here's your 1-year contract. We're going to give you a bunch of bad players, but we've scouted them and they might get really good. That's already warning signs for me, just because of the level of thinking that's gone into it. But it's still, that's the standard. There's no.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is where we have to go as an industry. That we can't, as you've said repeatedly through across your platforms, like we can't all be like critically invested in winning because we can't all win, and there has to be more to it. And I think especially in esports, there has to be other benefits and developmental opportunities that we can strive for. And actually, I think for a lot of people, a lot of coaches I've met across the ERLs and in remote teams, they love the game and they take on a coaching role, but actually they're really good with people, and actually they see the best in people, and they are ideally placed to help develop people and give them a good experience. And if they stepped into a role where it was maybe we can't go the whole way, but maybe there was some understanding on the org side that this isn't going to be a win now team. Can we do something else to compromise on that being the success, the marker of success or failure? There are lots of coaches out there who I think are perfectly placed to give young players a great place to develop and learn how to be a professional, and then springboard to the next stage. And then, so dream thinking that exists, but either way, there has to be some alignment. So if you know the goals of the org are win now, you can still be structured in your approach, and you can still think about, well, what methods will align with that. And actually, ethically and sort of duty and care wise, one of the micro level steps will be as early as possible to make it clear to players that that's the environment they're stepping into. So don't spring it on them that this is going to be a performance driven environment. We're really striving for high performance, and we can't really accept not making playoffs, for example. Then that's going to inform your day to day, because you're going to have to take an ethical approach to informing players about that, preferably before they sign, because if they don't know what they're getting into and you throw it on them, that's poor practice. So you can be structured in the respect that you're just thinking about how the overarching goal aligns with you day to day. Dream thinking, it's not always going to be win or nothing else. There might be something else involved. So it might be that, am I wrong in thinking there have been teams that maybe have picked up unknown players and sold them for high profits? Maybe that's
not many. There have been teams that have picked up lesser known players to develop them.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said before we went live, in esports, we're only just getting used to the idea of like proper scouting, I think would be the way to describe it. So the teams that have done that, and you've been able to promote young and up and coming players, they've already been up and coming before. So it was investing more in the scouting and that kind of thing. And in a sense, that does tie into what we're talking about. It's more maybe, again, the structure of the person beyond the head coach. If you've got a head of LOL or whatever you want to call it. So maybe it's not something specifically for coaches, but I think, like I say, the scouting side of things is starting to go that way. Although often it's like everyone wanted that player. And then the team that got him brag about how good their scouting is, as if like it's also the big budget. That's why you've ended that's why you've ended up with the player. Like, I mean, not to burst anyone's bubble, everyone wanted Kalist. Like, he went to the team who was going to pay him loads, and he aligned with their values and all those kind of things. And it is a great fit, of course, but still, it's not like this wonder scouting that came from nowhere. It's like everyone's aware. So. I think there are teams who have found players and then sold them to big teams, but really few. We're talking like a couple of examples. There are a lot more examples of teams who have got a player and then shown that they're very good, and then the player has gone somewhere else when their contract's up. but there's not very many examples of them being sold on for profit. It's more like their contract just finishes
Yeah.
and then they just go to a team for free, which is
It wasn't
the standard.
intentionally. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's starting to change, but up until like literally two years ago, let's say, the standard for 90+% of players was just this massive free agency where like everyone's contracts were all finished, which is really not a thing that happens in sport where like almost every single player is on the market all at one time. They're all like sold at least a year before their contract's up so that they're or re-signed so that you never come into this situation where it just finishes on November 15th and then they're going to go somewhere else for free, probably with your competitor who's paying them more money.
Yeah. Especially tough when we think about the academy system and the idea that are we actually seeing academy teams at the moment, or are we just seeing reserve teams with the players actually there just in case one of the main team players falls short or gets moved on? So that's problematic. However, I think there is regardless, if you're a coach in esports or anywhere really, a big part of it is also you have to be at some point you have to be fairly authentic to who you are as a person. So even if it's a win now climate, there are still methods that you have to select from, and you would align those methods with organizational goals, but also for consistency and coherence over time, you have to align them with who you are as a person. So kind of what I'm getting at here is a good example would be if you think it's important to have a high level of holistic well-being and holistic health and fitness, and if you think those components are important for performance, then you would structure yourself, your coaching year, let's say your macro level planning, you would structure it such that the intermediary steps and the day-to-day would involve those aspects. So for example, your weekly plan would involve a dedicated 30 minutes, 60 minutes with a strength and conditioning coach, or in the gym, and then on a monthly basis you might review time in the gym or sessions or attendance at those sessions. And the idea is that it's nested in the different levels, and so that's your structure. And we don't need to go down this rabbit hole, but why that stuff is actually really important, and the authenticity point is really important, is that when you're in the moment with a team as a coach, you often have to make really fast decisions, and without the sort of the planning and the structure you have created, you've mapped it all out, without having that thought out before you're in those environments, you might not have such a strong compass to guide those decisions, and they might always look a little bit different, and they might always be a little bit unexpected, and over time that can undermine things like trust and competence amongst the players, because they never know what you're going to come in with on a day-to-day. They never really know what to expect from you. So
and I think structure, if you're doing it like half is never that useful. Like if you start off saying you're going to insist on this holistic stuff and then partway through you stop insisting on the holistic stuff, it's better than just having not done it.
Yeah, exactly, because then the players are really lost because they don't know what to take, like what's really going to be happening. And great point.
Okay, so if I go over maybe the standard structure of an esports week in League of Legends, or we'll do the whole thing. So a standard year, and I won't give you the high bar, I'll give you the low bar version of someone who maybe hasn't considered this kind of proactively at all. So what you're naturally pushed into doing if you don't put the effort in to actually change the structure. If we're talking about macro, firstly, it's a year. That's the kind of bog standard, even still. So nowadays you've got 3 different splits. Probably as a coach, I think the low bar version is you're not actually thinking about anything other than we're going to win. We want to do as well as we can with the resources that we've got, with the players that we've got. And you might have another assistant coach working with you, and you maybe, hopefully, you did the interviews and stuff, and you picked someone that you liked. Quite often, I use that word intentionally. Quite often, that is the case. Of course, is the case everywhere, but I think also here more so. So there's two of you, let's say, or two or three of you. There's a manager as well. The manager is going to be the one doing the schedule and booking the scrims. What you'll do is you have however many competitive days you have, plus however many scrim days to equal 6 days a week, because 6 days a week is what we do. And you'll have your 1 day off after the competitive games, because that's what we do. And you will scrim on those days. And nowadays, it was different a couple of years ago. Nowadays, we do 5 scrims that start at either 2 in the afternoon or 3 in the afternoon. And what you'll be looking at most likely is at the beginning, you'll be doing whatever you consider fundamentals to be. And then probably what you'll do is you'll play a game, you'll talk about that game, you'll play a game, talk about that game, times 5. That's a scrim day. That's one of your how many? 4 scrim days a week, two competitive games, let's say, 2 competitive days. On competitive days, you'll talk about draft at some point during the day, but you won't do scrims because we don't do scrims on competitive days. Then you do that until you get knocked out. Then you wait until you need to play again. Then you start maybe a week before you do that until you get knocked out. Then you see where this is going. Then you wait until you need to play again. Then you do that until you get knocked out. And then that's your year. And you're done.
Mhm.
So if that's the standard, again, the SASE standard, maybe it's higher than that. And in probably a lot of cases, there's a few things that are different than that. Where do I go from there? If I'm coming to you and saying, right, like that's the structure that's kind of imposed on me. If I do nothing, that's what happens.
Yeah.
If I do nothing, I'm going to be told by the organization that we're working 6 days a week. We're scrimming every day, that we're not training. We're scrimming every afternoon. That's pretty much it. And therefore, the other stuff that happens is each day becomes just whatever was most important in that game, then whatever was most important in the next game, so on. And then the whole like time off thing, again, is normally just not even discussed. You just stop booking scrims when you get knocked out, and then you start booking scrims a week or two before you would start again when everyone else is doing it, because you can't even practice without other teams. So yeah, that's the baseline. That's what happens to you if you take no agency on it, and if you put no effort into the structured part of your coaching journey. And I do think still probably a vast majority of teams are very, very close to that, if not exactly on that. So where would I go? Where would I go from there?
Can I add one thing that I wouldn't be surprised to see in that example would be frequent U-turns on
Absolutely
game strategy.
That's another good thing. We decide what we're doing next week based on what the thing we did the worst at in the competitive games.
Bingo.
I can make a good case for that, which I will do later, but also that we'll lay that down as part of the default esports structure.
Yeah, I think it's the level of it. It's the expression throwing the baby out with the bathwater. This one thing didn't go as planned last week. We're going to just throw it out.
Last week we lost the game on Baron. Therefore, this week we're learning how to do Baron.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm laughing because
There's too much to go. Where do we even start? We'll do macro, meso, micro. So firstly, your macro thing.
Okay.
I can be the role of the organization if you want to ask me stuff, and I'll just pretend. I'll think of a thing in my mind if you want to. I guess maybe because the first step would be to find out. You talk about alignment before, like you have to start by asking what the organization might want.
Just to confirm, Mrs. Team Manager, you would like to win outright this year. You'd like to be on the big stage at the end of the year.
Yeah,
winning.
We want to get a title. That's what we want.
Excellent. That's great. So even now we have more clarity than we just had, because we had before win, but we had 3 splits to to win. And actually, even then, we have playoffs, and we probably have a grand finals or season finals at the end. So now we have the idea of actually, it's not critical to win every time, but we want to win maybe when it counts. So already you can see how maybe there's some there could be an increase in performance over the year, which means we don't necessarily need to start all guns blazing. We could maybe tinker with some things, and so then you might start thinking, well, how are we going to win with? Let's say I've been snapped up late as a coach, and like the roster is in front of me. Maybe I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, well, what do I think is going to produce that performance at the end of the year? Can this team, as constructed right now, do it, or do we need to work on some pieces? And maybe one of those pieces would be exciting rookie joins the team. So then we're thinking, okay, well, I've got some wiggle room at the beginning of the year. I've got to get here, and I think to get here, we need rookie player to step up. And so actually, maybe in that first third of the year, maybe my coaching on the sort of month to month or the week to week or day to day, actually it could be more developmental in giving this player learning or constructing learning situations for them to sort of step up into that might not produce the performance wins right then, but I know where I'm trying to get to. So maybe, for example, and this is one I like, and I think it gets a bit of an eye roll when you say it, but it could be that this player, let's say rookie player, is support or jungle, and we notice that they're not super confident vocally in game. So that means in that first half, the first third of the year, maybe I want to deliberately give them opportunities to lead a conversation. So maybe I give them a draft, or maybe and they have to make the decisions, or maybe I give them a review, like a 15-minute review after a game where they have to lead and they have to ask the questions and they have to get used to being the voice. So that sounds like very developmental. It sounds very like I'm not thinking about the wins. I'm thinking about giving this player a new experience or making them slightly uncomfortable. But I'm trying to develop the skills which I think align with this longer term vision. So already there we have one tangible thing we can do with identifying when we want to be performing and where we have room for flexibility and maybe experimentation. We want to be thinking, what are maybe my strengths as a coach? So am I good at framing experimentation? So, or do I have great reads of the meta, or do I need to play around and see what works with my players a little bit? If the latter, if you don't have to win in the first split, then maybe you can say, well, once a week we're going to have the green flag days. I think so. You're aware of this system where you have like a red, green, amber, or red, amber, green approach to training, where red is very competition-like, and we do everything on those days in training exactly as they might be expected or as close as possible. Amber might be a little bit more flexibility. Green might be purely experimental. So maybe one day a week we can have an experimental day where we play around with the meta, knowing that we're not going to do great, but we have things to work with in review. And that can be allowed within the window of knowing that the overarching goal.
Okay. So
For start.
Yeah, a great start. This actually, I heard this from a coach, but I'll pretend that I'm saying this as the organization. The best way to develop rookies is game time. So the deeper we go in spring is actually better. So we should be trying to go as deep. We should be trying to go as hard as possible in spring, because if we get knocked out in the group stage, like let's say you're in the LEC, right? That's a brutal format. I say brutal rather than terrible for now, where you have a couple of weeks, or even if you're in LTA, that's even worse. You have 2 best of 3s. If you lose that, that's it. You're off. You're done. Now, for some teams, that it means you're on holiday. So what would you say to that? If I'm the organization saying, okay, like that's all well and good, but why are we more likely to win in the end rather than now? So I want my title. Shouldn't we just try and get it 3 times? And then if we get one of them works and 2 of them don't work, isn't that better than trying to get it once and some like sort of throwing these splits? And don't I just need more game time with my players and that's all I need? Again, this actually came from a coach, but let's pretend it's coming from an organization instead.
Yeah. So I think that's probably the reality as well. And also, I don't think you're going to be able to do this as a coach where you implement a plan that suggests we're not going to try and win. We're going to try and play around and make mistakes for the purpose of learning. I don't think that's going to fly in many situations. So your pushback there is probably actually the reality. So then I think it's more about setting expectations with the players. So if you've got the rookie player, I think it's got to be, and you see them as an important piece, but also someone that has room for development. And yet you think that deep playoff run in the more playoff experience, the better to grow and handle that. And actually, it would be nice to get an unexpected win out of the gate, because that will fuel confidence. Maybe those are things you're really striving for. I think it's just saying that, ensuring that everyone is aware that we have multiple opportunities. Yes, we want to win. We're not going to be devastated if we don't win in the first instance. We really will try and go for it, though, and we'll treat our day-to-day as such. So there won't necessarily be a free-for-all experimental day. We're probably going to try and practice strictly what we want to play in our drafts and scrims. However, the support will be there after, like, in downtime, to talk through what we're seeing and talk through experiences we're having, and there will be some sympathetic arm or a shoulder for you should we not progress in the first instance. And I think that's, I mean, I could imagine a lot of coaches try and do that, because that seems to me just like a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah. It is maybe another approach to this idea of building to one title rather than going for three, or going for every single win, is another thing, as well as the experimentation and all those kind of things, just the intensity and the quantity, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So right, in what is it called now? Winter, spring, summer. In the winter split, we're gonna only do this much work, and then in spring we're going to do a bit more, and then in summer we're going to do a bit more? Or do you think, because the other thing is that, and I've heard this as a question, and I think it's a very legitimate one, if you're going to later on do stuff like night blocks or morning blocks as well as your 5 scrims, we need to do them at the beginning so that people start to get used to them. So is that something that you're considering if you're thinking about this idea where, okay, right, your way of making it so we're best chance to win at least one out of these 3 is actually not to go for all 3, but to go for the third one the hardest, and go for the other 2 a little bit more, allowing for a bit more experimentation, allowing for a bit more exploration. Would you also be playing around with the intensity of that? Would you be trying to, however you can impact that, which again is, as coaching, it's already hard. I was talking to Duffman about this, like he was talking about that as an idea. Like, it was very difficult to try and win everything because they wanted to win every single split, and it's very difficult to perform well at Worlds after you've tried to win every single split. T1, who won both times, didn't win splits. They didn't play that much. They didn't play that well. Well, they obviously played a lot, sorry, but they didn't play that well, and you don't know how much of that is intentional. But even then, because you don't control the scrims, you can't say, right, we're only going to do 4 games of scrims every time in spring, because you don't get to decide that. It's so hard to actually put your fingers on the scale, as it were, as a coach. That's what I'm kind of getting at. So would that be something you would factor in, and how might you go about doing that, considering we can't really control the practice environment?
Yeah, well, in the most honest way possible and not at all patronizing. I'm really impressed, because this is a fairly advanced concept in sport coaching that I only know about from a deep reading of physical training programs in sports teams around the idea of periodization. And we know periodization because we always talk about in-season, off-season, post-season, pre-season. We know those terms in esports, but there are more advanced levels to it. So you're talking about looking at the intensity, which is hugely impressive to have in your head as a coach, practicing coach, because actually there are things called strategic periodization, where you might look at your competitive schedule and you might change the intensity in terms of how many scrim blocks we have, how many games we play, what are the other activities we do in that week, depending on how you perceive the strength of the opponent, for example. You might think about things like, are we about to be playing an opponent with a very high rank? Have they had success previously? Do we have a super week? Do we have a normal week? And you might change how you approach it, your intensity, based on those things. And it sounds so obvious, but what it requires is looking at your long term and then saying, well, I'm going to make these changes in intensity, and how is that going to reflect what we do on a day to day? So you know, if you really want to like up the ante in that first split, you might try a few very loaded weeks. So you might try a couple of weeks maybe where you have more scrim blocks with more scrims in them, maybe like 2 blocks a day, that kind of thing. And you might load it up with a few meetings, and you might try and sort of say like, this is as intense as it's going to get, and you might try and work it in early on to see how the team responds. And you might do that in a week where maybe the opponents aren't quite, you perceive them as playing maybe less strong, so you can afford to do that and see where that comes from. And then you see how the team responds to having a less intense week ahead of a game where you perceive the opponent as stronger. And that's strategic periodization. And it sounds so obvious, as I said, but it just requires looking ahead, knowing what and why you're trying to achieve, why you're trying to achieve it. So that's really interesting.
Okay. So
and within that too, there's also integrated periodization, which is this is where you really have to know yourself as a coach. Like, what do I think is important for performance? Do you think holistic well-being is important as performance? Then in that case, I look at my competitive schedule and I think, where can I integrate the specialist support? And knowing that in advance and when and why, that's that would be performance long term. I want to win. I see holistic health and well-being as important for performance. Therefore, on my week to week, I have to integrate that somehow. On my month to month, I want to be achieving so many sessions, and that's great structure.
Yeah. So I think a lot of this, people are starting to get more comfortable with in the idea of like in the meso level, like week with the structure of your week. And so a coach that I was working with in the LFL, for example, was like, I've said that I want to book our best scrim opponents in the middle of the week. So if we're scrimming, let's pretend we're scrimming Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, then Tuesday and Wednesday are when we scrim the hardest opponents that we could possibly find, because then the intensity hopefully ramps up and then back down a little bit. So it's not really intense right before the training day. I also love the idea of, assuming I'm using kind of the wrong words for these things, so you'll have to forgive me for that, what I would call tactical periodization, the sort of Mourinho idea of changing the goal of the day as well to align with your periodization. And I think that's a really, really big one that I'm trying to do at the moment with Nord, but it's quite difficult because we're not a full-time team, and we're also kind of doing it with less coaching staff than I think it needs. And also we have to balance the stream thing, which we'll get onto when we talk to the meso level. But first, let me not get distracted by my original question, which is, you mentioned there the idea of playing with intensity in your week. But if we focus on the macro, would you actually play with intensity over the splits? Or do you think that if we're going to take a break after every split, it's okay to just have each split is 6 days a week, scrim day on as many days as we're not playing competitive days will obviously be intense anyway? Like, would you be thinking about that? Would you be balancing that as well? Or do you just think the same is okay and we'll maybe have a bit more during the splits, but not like, okay, winter is light, spring is medium, summer is heavy?
Me as Watson, I would be very cautious about that, because I also know that esports at present, there is still this ethos of winning and demonstrating your in-game skill. And I've seen how that manifests in professional players, where in split and in off season, they're maintaining 2 challenger accounts, for example. They're playing a high volume of games. They're really grinding on 2 accounts, and they're doing it because they see it as their best chance of ensuring their next contract. And I mean, I remember one player, wrist injury, still had these 2 very high rank accounts, maintained them throughout the year. And I wouldn't have said to myself, if I was a head coach, I wouldn't have said, okay, we can push it in split because I know off season will be less intense, because actually it would give this player more time just to play solo queue. And actually I think this is where your coaching philosophy has to come in, and your are you someone that, do you put your player well-being, do you value that highly, and do you really put effort into understanding their needs? And I mean, in my view, I think across the board, really ethically, you should get to know your players and their needs and their tendencies, perhaps, if you can, because without knowing, for example, in this case, without knowing that this player feels the pressure to grind and maintain high-ranking accounts, although they are currently on a well-paid contract, if you don't know that about your player and you assume off-season will be relaxed when they're actually feeling even more anxious because they're sitting around not doing much and they're worried about next year, then you're doing them a disservice. Assuming your performance model is that my players won't perform well if they're burnt out, so I need to pull them back from the brink of that. So, however, that being said, I also know that at G2, for example, I think this is out there, they have spoken quite prominently about the fact that, like, working within our team in split is hard. We do a lot, we demand a lot, and we see that as our model of high performance, and then we take recovery seriously when we have that opportunity. So yeah, I guess this is where the planning can't just be decided by your org. You are not a robot being fitted into a system. You also bring your own aspect to it. So they should know that when they hire you, and you should know it when you hear their demands about what they want from you.
And the intensity of each split, forgetting the season and an off season, the intensity of each split is maybe less of a factor, because obviously it's different in sport depending on the sport as well. But if you think about cyclists, for example, people who are Grand Tour cyclists might base their entire year, about being as good as possible in a 3-week period that's the Tour de France, and everything else, including the other Grand Tours, are a little bit like, it's like a warm-up.
Yeah.
The Vuelta is a little bit of a warm-up for the Tour de France, and that's just the way that people approach it. And that maybe the slightly worse cyclists do it the other way around, where like they want to just get round the Tour and they want to try and place high on the Vuelta, for example. And so then you're talking about finding the things that actually are good, and that's where it's good for as an organization, to be honest. Like, it's not good for you if you're the 10th best, or if you're the 20th best and you want to get a top 10 finish. You should be honest about that with yourself and first get a top 10 finish in the event that other people take a little bit lighter, and you build your whole year around peaking at that time instead of peaking at the slightly later time of the Tour. Does that kind of thing, do you think, does that factor in esports? Or because it's much more of a mental game, and like you say, it's hard to even know if sometimes off season might be more stressful for people, and sometimes there's going to be stuff that's stressful because like the game changes and suddenly all your champs are bad. That's a stressful moment, and you have no control or knowledge of that going into the split. So is it something that you would actually consider, just from a macro point of view? So making sure off seasons are actually off season, I think, is a really big thing and actually important, especially in the ERLs. We quite often don't even consider it at all. Making sure you have enough ramp back time so that people can really be off, rather than feeling like, well, we'll come back and we'll being clear about what level you need as well. I think when people come back is an important one, because you don't want to waste the whole week of practice because people came back having not played a single game for a month, but you also don't want people to, you do want people to have time off. So that completely on board with. Would you do, let's say we're in this team, we've got this promising rookie, so we might be a bit more experimental, a bit more exploratory in winter and spring, and a bit more hardcore serious in summer. But would we be more volume in summer than we would be in other splits? Or is there just a probably correct volume which we need to find with these players in this environment, in this country where, let's pretend it's in person, in this country, in this, with this whole setup, which actually it's probably better to just use winter and spring to find what that correct volume is for us, rather than saying, okay, spring is going to be, sorry, I keep getting confused. They didn't used to be a winter split. That's why it's hard to factor it in my head. Winter is the like 8 out of 10.
Yeah.
Spring is 9 out of 10. Summer is 10 out of 10. And then you get a big break at the end. So would you actually, is that something that is even worth considering? Or is it just, let's find the right amount of work for us? Do we do 5 days a week in winter, sorry? Or, anything like that?
Yeah. I'll eat my piece of humble pie and say that I just don't think we know yet. Because as you say, things change, and we don't actually know much about. We don't know what the changes are for sure. We don't know how that will impact our team. So maybe it could well be, if you're a league team, you might think that actually we've got an advantage right now because our champs are favourable in this meta. So let's go for it.
Yeah.
And I think that uncertainty is really crucial because if you spoke about sort of like ramping up in sports, like think about the time frames we're talking about. I think Olympics is every 4 years. If you're in athletics, a world championship every 2 years. Every 2 years, like the event that's coming up in 2 years, you're not taking seriously because of the one in 4 years. But then you compare that to league, where it's actually I'm only certain of what's happening in this 3-month period. It's like,
yeah. But it is risky, like, okay, maybe less we have people being injured. But again, if we take cycling as an example, from the last couple of years, the top 2 riders have both been injured pretty soon before the Tour de France, and they both raced, but the other one won both years.
Yeah.
The other one who wasn't injured won, and it wasn't necessarily just because of that, but it can't be ignored. And maybe we don't have that as an equivalent. But if you say, right, we're going to just experiment and learn as much as possible in winter, because in spring and summer, or we're even going to do both, let's say, and spring as well, because in summer we're going to hit it really hard. And then your rookie mid laner who plays control mages, suddenly in summer, it's just not that meta, and everyone has to play melee champs. Well, that's unlucky.
Yeah.
It's like practicing for the Tour de France and suddenly like, okay, the Tour de France is now on mountain bikes.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's helpful for some people and terrible for other people, and probably more terrible for the people who are more specialized on those other specific systems of the game. So yeah. I think it's a risky one. That's for sure.
Really risky. Yeah. However, if you were to push me for an answer, I would say yes, I would ramp up the intensity in terms of, not drastically, but I would probably ramp up the intensity in terms of, oh, hang on. No, because so many things here. Like, one would be, do you have the sense that your players want to have this feeling of, I want to leave everything out there always? And there are players that want to feel like in every instance, they've given everything they've got. And if that's what they're after, and you can cater it with the holistic health and well-being measures necessary to accommodate that, then maybe you have to go with that, because that's what they're expecting. That's what they're deriving their satisfaction from, and maybe that would fuel new levels of performance. I would be maybe inclined to think about, to maybe just drop into any environment the fact that there are some things that are less objective that will develop the longer we're together. And actually, it's in our interest to leave some room for those things. So you mentioned earlier being on the same page. That's not something that we can just deliberately say we're going to raise the intensity on getting better at being on the same page. That's going to be something that will come with time, because we don't always know exactly what buttons to press to achieve that.
It
So I
could be a
think that,
bigger part of your focus, though, I guess.
yes, that's kind
Yeah.
of what I mean. Yeah. So it's not so much that we're saying, we're going to ramp up from like 3 scrim blocks a week to 4 to 5. It's not maybe not so tangible as that, but it's maybe just the emphasis in that first split will be, we're not maybe going to evaluate quite so much the decision making regarding how support roamed, but we're going to evaluate more how things were communicated, because we want to be on the same page more.
Yeah.
So that's how I would maybe change it.
Yeah. Okay. That actually, again, I think is something that I do recognize in other coaches as well, especially when it
Great.
comes to the game. This idea of like kind of band-aiding, and you might only do that. Band-aiding in winter seems a bit silly, but band-aiding in summer seems like the best thing to do. Where it's like, okay, let's say it's moved to a full melee meta because there's 3 melee champs in mid that are just ridiculously good, and your mid laner can't play them. In winter, you might say, right, we're going to play them anyway, and we might well lose, but we're going to get better at playing them, and you can't get better at playing them without playing them.
Yeah.
But in summer, we might say, right, we're just going to ban all 3, and it's going to suck to not have bans ever. But I mean, I've done that very unsuccessfully at one point because I thought the roster was going to be there for a 1 split. And so I just did everything was band-aids, and like it was just a mess. And then the same roster was there for the next year. So that was a bit of a disaster. Okay. So that's good. I think that gives people a really good starting point for the macro side of this is going to be the full episode, just for anyone wondering, like, because I've still got so many things I want to ask about. It's already been an hour. So that's the macro and the approach to how you would do that.
Mm-hmm.
If we then move to the meso thing, for meso, we're talking about, if a split is 2 months ish, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, depending on how well you do. Is meso 1 split, or is meso 1 week, or does it not matter? Should we talk about first a split, then a week, or how do we go forward from here?
I think the most useful way of thinking about it is what would be a natural cycle for you. And so I wouldn't say a full split is a cycle. I think in esports, I actually think a cycle in league, I think a cycle would be your week.
Yeah,
including
week or 2 week. Yeah, 2 week allows you to say like, it's a new patch every 2 weeks.
Yeah. So for me,
sometimes.
That's a nice
not
cycle.
Always. Yeah. Okay, so let's say a week then. Here I can talk about the thing that I've been wanting to do and tried now with Nord. Like I say, it hasn't gone exactly as I would want to, but I can lay out how I would want to do it. So I've been calling it tactical periodization or non-linear periodization. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's what I've found from my non-scientific research into the matter. The idea is, what you normally do with a goal is you might have a goal, okay, maybe you do a couple, and maybe it'll be more than 1 week, but if we're focusing on just the week thing, it's like, okay, our goal for the week is this. Like we say, often it's because that was the thing that we were the worst at in the competitive game. So we were the worst at Baron. We lost 2 games. Out both our games we lost because we threw at Baron. Therefore, next week our goal is to learn about how to set up and do Baron properly. And then you do that for the whole week. And then when that's done, you then play your competitive games. And then there's a different problem. And you say, okay, that's the goal for that week, and then we do that. And the way I do the goal, we'll talk about that later, because the day is the micro one, right? So we'll talk about that in a bit. And if you are being a bit more proactive with it, and if you're thinking a bit more on the longer time frame, you maybe already have those. They're not based on just we were bad at Baron this week, but instead they were decided beforehand. And maybe that's because of your structure of the game. We're going to learn first about, I don't know anyone who does it like this, but let's say the early game, then the mid game, then the late game. And we're actually just learning about stuff based on the timing of the game. So that's the kind of standard. But for me, I think that has a bunch of different problems. Not least of all is it's boring to just every single day be like, we're going to learn about Baron today. And the next day, right, what did we learn about Baron yesterday? And we're going to keep learning about Baron today until like we're roughly good enough at it to leave it, roughly
Mhm.
ish. And like, how are we going to decide that? We'll know it when we get there. That kind of thing. But the other thing is that you end up being so reliant on this game that we can't control. It
Yeah.
could be you go through a whole day with only 1 or 2 max Baron potentials. Like that even happen. The game is not even by 20 minutes very often in scrims. And so the chances of it coming up are kind of low. And you might still learn some things. And just by having something as a focus, you will learn stuff about it. So that's already better than not having anything as a focus for me, even if you're doing it this way. And so what I've wanted to do and what I'm trying to do this split, but I think it would work better for other reasons, is instead do this idea of like non-linear or tactical, where rather than like, okay, this week and then next week builds on that and then next week builds on that, it's more like day builds on day. So again, if we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday as our scrim days, let's say, Mondays are all about, if I use the same example, Mondays are all about Baron. And then Tuesdays are all about team fighting. And then Thursdays are all about side lanes. And Fridays are all about draft or something else. I wouldn't split it up like that, but that's a different point.
Yeah.
And then you learn on Monday some stuff about Baron. And then next Monday, you keep learning stuff about Baron. And you do it like that. Because like I say, I think the big one is that each day is variety. The next thing that's appealing for me is that you can play with the intensity, where stuff that's the day about draft is probably quite a light day because you actually don't need to review the game much, if at all. The main thing is let's talk about the draft. So maybe that's the first day back when a new patch comes out is actually the day where we're focused on draft, because what we need to learn from today is how did this patch affect how we're going to draft? And we don't need to learn anything about the game. We just need to learn that. So let's all just have a relaxed 10, 15 minutes in between the games, or even a really short time. We only have 10 minutes in between the game. We're just going to come together and chat about draft. Or maybe that's before your competitive games because you have the draft pretty much sorted and you're just dealing with the last little things. And then the other really big one for me is that we can then hopefully get a bit more control back about what we're actually doing, because they're probably only, maybe there's 1 or 2 Barons in the day, but because the only time you did Baron was last Monday, you now have 4 days worth of it to look back on. And now you actually can say, right, here's 4 examples, which I'm going to gradually show them throughout the day, or maybe we'll show them in one go, if that's better. Here's 4 examples of us doing it. And here's the kind of tendencies that we can actually infer from 4 examples rather than just one in the day. So yeah, that's my current approach to this meso kind of idea. For me, at the moment, it's been very big. Like I'm putting the goals into kind of big buckets. And then on each day, it will still be a kind of more specific goal, but it falls into the Monday bucket, let's say.
Mhm.
So it would be, for me, my system for seeing the game is it's about generating time, using time, and team fighting. That's pretty much what the game is about. And so those are my big buckets. We only scrim 3 days a week. So each, like, okay, this is the team fighting day. And then the other day was, this is the generating time day. And this is the using time day. But using time is not a goal. It's like, here's the goal is Baron, for example, is a way to use time. So therefore Baron would fall into that, if that makes sense. So that's currently my approach, which would be quite different in a full-time team, very different if we're all in person, all those kind of things. But that's kind of my overall. So what do you think? What do you think about it? What are there questions about it? Other things that we could do, things that we could push it forward, all those kind of things.
Potentially, I mean, not at this point, not much to say about that. I think that's your. I think your. It's great. Oh, it's just it makes a ton of sense not to be linear in it, and to give a very sort of basic example of why that might not work is if you were coaching football and you said this month we're going to work on passing, next month we're going to work on dribbling, and after that we're going to work on finishing. You're right, it all comes up in a game in a messy way. So it kind of makes no sense to equip your players with those skills.
And even less sense in esports because the only way we practice is a full game.
Yeah.
So they've got to do all those other skills. Even if we're not focusing on them, they've still got to do them, and they know they've got to do them. And I think one of the other things actually that just reminded me, one of the other reasons why I like it is because I do like to be very goal focused, but there will be important things that happen in a game. And because there's you always still you do have a lot of time, but you kind of feel like you don't have a lot of time.
Mm.
And so players especially are saying, like, can we talk about this thing that's completely irrelevant to the goal but was really important for this game? And if you're doing like, this week we're learning this goal, and then they ask something that's really important for this game but it's not the goal, then it always feels really bad to say, like, well, no, we're not going to talk about it, and potentially we're not going to talk about it for a week. Whereas doing it this way, it's like, well, it's not the goal today, but it's the goal for tomorrow, so it's going to, like, we'll talk about it tomorrow, and then we actually can do that, and we actually have that important conversation around the topic leading into a day where we're focusing on the topic, and those kind of things.
So I think, I mean, you've articulated it perfectly, and I would agree with how you approach it. I think it's more a case of, I think the meso level, the idea of having cycles is less relevant for the players and actually more relevant for you as a coach, just to have a consistent thread in where your focus is for that cycle. And then you can map your cycles across your longer goal, your time, let's say your year, because you can think about, okay, if on Monday setting up for objectives, Tuesday draft, and you do it all in a given week, but actually and your players are aware of that pattern and they focus on those things on those days, but you're maybe consistent in what you're looking for. And at the end of your cycle, you could even grade your perception of the quality of improvement in the thing you're actually looking at consistently, whilst making it not a major topic on every day, and being responsive to what the players are seeing a little bit. And you can just map the grade that you give yourself or give the team in that cycle to have some idea of progression. But it's not. Yeah, I think it's maybe more useful for you as a coach, because it's in the short term. Yeah, I think in terms of like the tangible focus goals as you're talking about, that's a good way of doing it. If you think about things like maybe less tangible, less objective things that are part of performance, you can actually they can play a bigger part in your meso goals, because you could think about, in the short term, it's important to get routines embedded and processes, get players up to speed with different processes that we're doing. So if you in your one of your early meso cycles could be to introduce the players to these foci of different days within a cycle. And so in the short term, one of your meso level goals will be like, are we achieving that? Are we getting good at that kind of process?
So even if each day might have a specific goal for the scrims, it's good to have a goal as a coach of, like, still I have the goal for the week, or let's say the 2 weeks, if you wanted to maybe split it up, but like, okay, how we approached this set. Okay.
I think so. And it could be, I don't know if every sports coaching researcher and sports coaching practitioner might agree with me here, but I think it's just, it comes back down to this, how are you making decisions as a coach? And if you yourself don't have a thread that you're looking for, or a general North Star that you're aiming towards in a given moment, you might be pushed off course.
Yeah, and you might be stuck just going round and round and round.
Yeah.
Like, how do you know if this week has gone well if every day is just the same as the last Monday and then the same as the next? Okay, so what kind of goal could you have? What sort of things are you thinking about then, if you're thinking about a meso goal in that way? Because it's easier to think about these and conceptualize these, actually, when you're saying, this week we're going to get better at Baron, and we'll know if we did well because we'll be better at Baron. So let's say you're not doing that and it's actually a non-gameplay one. What are the other examples that come to mind? So you mentioned how people are dealing with the structures that we're putting in place. Maybe you even can, I don't know if you just have feedback or anything, but other, like, what are kind of other optional goals or areas that could inspire people to get a good meso goal for themselves?
Yeah, maybe it's
putting you very much on the spot, I'm aware.
Well, no, I really like the interpersonal ones. I've always been a big fan of empowering roles and empowering players. Roles doesn't make any sense, but I've always been a fan of sort of giving player a voice, and I think I maybe push that a bit too much sometimes. But for example, I've worked with rosters where top laner has been very quiet and rarely says anything, and partly yes, it's because of the role, but also sometimes the player in question has been a bit quieter, and I felt like maybe if this went on over time, they might feel slightly isolated from the team. And so maybe a short-term, middle-term focus of mine was how can I create situations where I foster a greater sense of integration between this player and another, or this player and the whole team. So a cycle for me could be, in this cycle, have I done a few things? Has my thread been I've consistently looked for opportunities to hear from this player, or I've consistently tried to pair this player with the jungler to get them to make a decision around something that's come up in the week, whatever that might be. And so that's it's much softer, I suppose. Like it's not your tangible, where are we warding properly, that kind of stuff. But I think it's something that can be nice to build into those
And
meso cycles, because it's just something you're consistently looking for.
yeah, it's always nice to have goals, I think, that are not to do with the game.
Right.
For yourself as well, because like we say, the stuff that you're going to work with the players is almost always going to be the goals that you're working with them on are either going to be like very specific holistic ones, or they're going to be the game.
Yeah.
In which case,
And
having
they're
stuff like
always
that for
gonna be,
yourself,
sorry to interrupt, they're always going to be in front of you. You're not going to forget.
much
You're
more
going to need to
obvious.
put
So
it
you,
outside.
yeah,
Yeah. But if you're thinking in the back of your head, like if you're like even on these podcasts, like sometimes your thoughts don't come out clearly, and you're not quite sure what to say next. But if you're in the middle of a scrim, like a VOD review, and you're suddenly like, oh, I'm sensing I'm coming to the end of my thought process here, I'm not sure what to say next, but you can always lean on top laner. What did you think? Like that could be, it can be just something else that's not so obvious in front of you, but you've got it in your head, you've prepared it, you've planned, that's part of your plan, you know where you're going with it, so you can rely on that. I think that's good.
Yeah, I think it's really good. And I think it's really good advice in general, because again, because of the structure of how things are set up, you do have to be really cautious with what's happening naturally in terms of, so because of the way we practice and because of the way we do the micro cycles and the micro goals, it's pushing you in a certain direction already. So having these meso goals being something a bit different can be really, really useful. It's a similar tangent for the same reason, but a different thing, which is that the game itself makes certain things very punishing and makes certain things very rewarding. So you have to factor that in as a coach. It's always feels bad to die, for example. And so the game itself pushes you to not die. And so therefore I should think about that as a coach. Or because we're scrimming and because we're playing a full game against another team that we probably know, with players that we probably know, it feels bad to lose. And so just saying we're just going to focus on improvement, you have to be aware that the game is telling them this is bad.
Yeah.
A bad thing that is happening. And so again, I think that's a really useful thing to think about when you're thinking about these like meso cycles of what's happening naturally and what's naturally being pushed. And maybe the natural thing is a lot game focused, for example. And so having your own internal goal as like, okay, for this week or for this 2 weeks, I'm going to get the top laner more involved and make them feel more comfortable, make them a bigger part of the process. That can be absolutely fantastic. Because if you do your thing of like, we're going to get better at Baron, it's like, well, you're kind of pushed in that way anyway. And so putting extra focus on it is like less productive, and also kind of what you were going to do anyway. And so what does that change? And then again, you get stuck in this, stuck on the treadmill of just every week blends into the next, which is so common.
Yeah.
That is the doing even not quite full-time scrims again. That just, it's like, who did we play yesterday? What did we draft? What did we learn? Like it just all so quickly blends. So having something a bit different, I like.
Yeah, for sure. You made me think of one actually. You said something just now that made me think of actually maybe an interesting early stage meso goal might be something that you do, like a coaching behavior that you demonstrate or don't demonstrate that you want to do more or less of. So maybe you're conscious that you tend to fill the space with your own voice a lot, and maybe a meso goal, a red thread for you could be to embrace some silence to see what pops up. Actually, that's an interesting one. Just being, it might not be one you could articulate it to players to help them understand why you're being silent at times. But actually, working on yourself as a coach could also be an interesting meso goal. And I say meso because like it's just something you're looking for across that cycle, but it doesn't have to be true in every instance. So it's just something that more often than not in this cycle.
Yeah, much more appropriate to think about that in terms of a week rather than just one
Yeah.
day. Here's one day where I'm going to talk less. It's like, okay. Clap,
Yeah.
clap.
Yeah, I did this. Yes, done. Yeah.
Okay, so
Cool.
we covered macro, covered meso, micro. Again, this time I'll just lay out the standard, what happens, and I'll lay it out in the lowest bar version. And you can maybe ask me any follow-up questions, because I if I don't say something, it'll probably be just because I've forgotten, not because there's necessarily nothing happening around that. But we have scrims in the afternoon. 14 CET start is kind of standard. 15 is for some of the more gamery specific rosters. Maybe try and push for that sort of thing. With a lot of people, they might well wake up. Well, they'll wake up before scrims. Sometimes they might not wake up very much before scrims. If you're in person, you'll probably have lunch together first, I would guess, if lunch is kind of provided. That might be something we do together. That might not be. That might be just you go and get lunch from 1 till 1:30. Then again, it doesn't actually happen like this very often anymore. But let's say, worst case, you come together, you play the first game, you maybe give people a little break in the review. Maybe you have 20 minutes, let's say, 3 or 4 minutes, they go off, then they come back. Then we talk about the things that were most important in that game. Then we go into the next game. That happens 5 times. Then people go off and play solo queue. They might do an individual session like coaching a player. They might do like exercise or things they want to do. The coach's version of solo queue is normally watching competitive games. Sometimes it is actually solo queue as well. I know some coaches who play a lot of solo queue, which always seems, I don't know how they have the time, but still. Yeah, so that's kind of our normal micro structure. Again, if I'm doing nothing, you can forget even everything other than the scrims. Scrims happen to us. And let's say that's it. So the scrims happen to us. We all agreed at the beginning that we're going to play a lot of solo queue because we believe in leaving it all out there, like you said. So we all agreed that we're going to play 50 solo queue games a week, and we're going to scrim 4 times a week. That's what happens on our micro. That's the micro structure that we've got. So where would you start? Like, how can we maybe improve this a little bit? How can we tweak this a little bit? Any other things that you would want to know first going forward? So again, still with that same thing of the macro goal being getting a title, the meso goal maybe being the week is structured with an actual intensity that we've decided, where we get more intense, then less intense before the competitive games. The goals of the day will be different. But how do we go about getting some micro structure into this made up situation?
Yeah. So we can talk about tricky from sports coaching literature, because that would traditionally talk about the percentage of practice time, let's say on pitch practice time, that is spent in what you might describe as more drill-based isolated practice, and what is spent in more game-like representative practice. Very tricky to translate that to esports, because that is easier to map to an overarching macro level goal. For example, if you if you want to improve players' decision making, then actually maybe spending more time in representative type practice is good, because players have to do things in maybe more real life game settings, and they have to make decisions. Whereas if you isolate practice, it's a bit sterilized and you can maybe control it, but you're maybe not working on decision making quite so much as just execution of that skill in that drill. So in sport, that would be just looking at the percentage of how much time in practice is spent on what. In league, very tough, because
Everything is game practice. Yeah.
yeah, everything is a full game. So you maybe want to think about. I think the one thing you can really play around with is player agency. So in a 5-game block, again, where are the opportunities for the players to have voice? Like, where do they get to have a say or not? How much input do I, as a coach, accept or not? How much do I go through the lens of fixing mistakes or asking reflective questions? That's maybe a line you can play around with. I would say that if you don't have a great deal to play around with, I think, in the scrim block environment. I think you could say, if you were looking to develop, you could play around with the roles perhaps slightly. Like, you could give someone a role around communication. Like, they have to alert the team to a certain thing, and they have to try and do that. And you can say, like, this is a focus. It might not be representative of how we're going to operate in a game, but it's something I want to see in this practice, and that's going to align with a more development kind of goal. Or you could say you want to be game-like, and you want the sort of natural shot caller in the team to be making the decisions. So therefore, we want to be focusing in the micro level. We want to be focusing on cutting out unnecessary chatter in verbal communication in game, and we want the shot caller to be making those decisions. But you don't really get to play around with much pedagogy as a coach. You don't get to be. You can't really decide to step in and use a practice tool and say, let's rehearse this thing, or let's play the full game. And there are constraints that we have played around with. For example, muting in the early game. So muting for the first 7 minutes of a game. But then there's been some pushback on that we have experienced in practice. Like, people saying, well, that's not how the game's going to be played. Why do we need to be playing without communication for a few minutes? And yeah, it's hard to make the case at the moment that it's necessarily beneficial. But I think the more interesting way of looking at micro in league would be your day. How are you conducting your day? So you mentioned, for example, waking up, lunch together in person, for example, and then going to the scrim block, and then how many games. I think it's more interesting to look at how that's conducted.
Definitely. Yeah.
For example, pre-game meets, the one-to-one meetings, like, how is all that structured? So that's where you have more scope to play around.
Yeah. So, okay, let's have a goal for the day that we come together and talk about. That's a good bit of structure that we can add on fairly quickly.
Yeah.
Now, for me, I do it in a pre-scrim meeting now at the moment, and when I'm online. But I would much rather do it not in a pre-scrim meeting. I would much rather do it, then go have lunch together, then come back and play a solo queue game and go pretty much straight into scrims, because you're about to do 5 hours or 6 hours of very intense work. Adding an extra half an hour on top of that at the beginning is not good, considering we could have the pre-scrim meeting before lunch and it's no worse. So we might as well split them up. So having a goal for the day, I think that's a good bit of structure. Do you think so? I know Kabir has talked about this a bit on his Twitter, this idea of, I think, can't remember exactly what he called it, like the spiral of getting deeper and deeper into a goal intentionally as we go through? Or is that something that's maybe too difficult, because we should probably put it all in the pre-scrim meeting? Because if I've got 5 examples of how to set up Baron, it seems a bit weird to show them one, then play a game, look at R1 compared to the next one, or something like that. Or is there a way to gradually advance the goal throughout the day? I guess the other we'll start with that. Start with that.
Certainly. I mean, in deliberate deliberately increasing difficulty and expectations for execution throughout a scrim block was interesting. Also because there are factors that you might say might be working against performance, so just mental fatigue. So if we can actually execute well towards the end of a scrim block rather than having the game 5 drop off in performance,
Fun
like
game.
if we can still be the fun game. Like I think there's something to be said for that. I lost my train of thought a little bit on this one, but I think
I mean, something I've done before as well is we were really struggling in game 5s a lot. And so actually after game 3, we had a break rather than a review. So again, that's a piece of structure where we say, okay, like we trade one review now for hopefully a game and a review later. Because not only do we lose the game 5 review because it's not worth looking at, we also lost the game 5 game because we all played just really silly and badly. And so we just put a bit more effort to be a bit more disciplined, and we had a little break in between. So you can try stuff like that. I mean, I know, like I say before, there was a while where we did 3 games, break 3 games. Again, this is not really structure that you can impact necessarily as a coach, unless you happen to be coaching G2, in which case you can just say, and then people will agree to still practice with you. So if you're the G2 of whatever your level is, if you're the best team in ERLs, people will probably do whatever structure you want, which I think, by the way, is far better for loads of other reasons. And I would have got way more creative with it, where I know Stellari, for example, did last year or the year before. They were one of the few teams I heard suggesting, well, if we're doing 3 games and then an hour and a half break and then 3 games, let's do 3 blue side games and then 3 red side games later, not blue, red, blue, red, blue, red. Like, because why are we doing that? So even stuff like that, I think, is an interesting idea. The other thing that I would do would be, well, okay, maybe over the evening games, let's say, like 3 break 3, the second break of 3, there's no VOD review. And then afterwards, we review all 3 games together. So rather than we just go game, 5 minutes, next game, 5 minutes, next game. Afterwards, let's have an hour where we talk about just the goal, because maybe in the beginning, the first 3 games, we talked about the goal plus a few other things, stuff like that.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the biggest thing you get to manipulate is your behavior as a coach. And cutting short a review. I think coaches should look into things like cognitive load theory, like how much can we actually really retain in working memory in a given moment. So if we're doing a 15-minute review and we're reviewing, as we said previously on this podcast, 10 to 15 points, how much of that is really going to be remembered? So actually play around with that. We can just have a couple of points very briefly and then a grand summary later on after 3 games, for example. I think retrieving points, this is something out like the sort of maybe more educational setting, would be a really effective means of learning is retrieval practice. So study something, leave it, come back to it, see how much you can recall. That's really effective. You can implement that into like maybe the review or the points in that pre-scrim review or meeting. Maybe you ask after game 3, what were our top 2 points of focus? Maybe that's just some way of ensuring some recall.
Yeah.
So implementing that.
Done that as well, a debrief at the end of the day, where the only question was like, what have we learned? What have you learned today? And each person has to have one of those. And it was funny was useful for a few reasons. Is that firstly, it's harder than you would think. So there's, let's say, 7 or 8 of us, a manager, 2 coaches, 5 players, together for 6 hours. And if you ask each person at the end, what did we learn today? The first couple might be easy, but after like the third one, we're starting to be a struggle, which I think is already quite an interesting thing to know and to be aware of. So maybe we shouldn't be quite so precious around scrims, and we should be a bit more exploratory, because if we just ran through the motions, I mean, it was different in before Fearless because you just played the same draft a bunch of times, or very similar drafts, very similar champions. And then the other reason for it is that firstly, you do the recall part, so hopefully they actually remember those things. And then what happens is, once you do it a few times, people started to kind of clock something in a review and think like, I'm going to say that later,
Hmm.
and that's like, okay, great, you
Yeah,
actually remembered the thing.
yeah,
And the very first time we did it, I was like, who wants to go first? No one wants to go first. And then it quickly became everyone wanted to go first in case someone else had stolen their one. And so
it's their thing. Yeah,
it can be quite an interesting way to do it. But then I also do have every single pre-scrim I start with summary of a recap, like what was the kind of key
great.
takeaways. And there's not always a key takeaway from a 20-minute discussion. I think that's another thing that's worth saying, is like, you don't have to have one
Yeah,
just because you had a discussion, but you might have three in the same discussion, where it's like, okay, for example, one that we had recently is like, okay, we should group up and TP away rather than TP to the group. And it wasn't actually to do with our goal, but it was a very useful thing that happened in the discussion. It's like, okay, good, let's remember that. So yeah, I think there is some stuff you can do, but we don't have all that much control over it in terms of the stuff around the actual structure of the day. But then, like
yeah,
you say, the structure of the rest of your day that's not scrims, plus how the VOD reviews are actually going, that's where you can really start to be intentional.
yeah. Exactly. That's the key word, being intentional. And it's a bit of a bit of a catchphrase, bit of a yeah, bit of a catchphrase that gets thrown around. But actually, you're intentional in alignment with your goal. So there is that red thread for you, for your team. Your coaching behavior can reflect that. And whilst you might not be able to change a great deal about the the game stuff, the training environment, or the training activity, you can change the environment and how you engage with it. And you can work on the interpersonal stuff in, whose voice am I going to be amplifying in this? Am I going to be, using these points of reflection? Am I going to be using these points of retrieval? Am I going to be giving players more breaks? All those kind of things I think can be integrated into the micro level, and they align with meso and macro. That's like just the key point, because it's very easy. It's maybe a harder thing to grasp what you can change, but it's very easy to see when things clash with the overarching goal. And it's exactly as we've said previously. Like, if you're a bit of a magpie coaching approach and you're just going for everything shiny and fixing mistakes, but actually it's not coherent with any overarching goal, you can see where it clashes and it doesn't work. So it's probably easier to think of examples where it doesn't work, but if you've got the first two in place, macro and meso, your micro can kind of fall into place a little bit, maybe.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a
No, I
harder
like
one, I
that.
think, in
I think
sports.
a great point, and I think yeah, it does lead on. It should lead on from the other ones.
Yeah,
Whereas I think if you're not intentional around it, it's the opposite. And the micro of what we learned today dictates how our week goes, and that dictates how our
yes,
split in year goes.
yeah,
And it ends up being the exact reverse order. And I do think that people would be more open to all this stuff around, okay, let's not just play 5 games with a 20-minute break, if they had considered the macro structure stuff you're talking about and the meso structure you're talking about. Then it can make more obvious sense that, I mean, again, if we take 3 break 3, we want to do the second block without any VOD reviews, because we only want to talk about the goal. We want to get
yeah,
the practice time in to play together, because that's super, super valuable. But then afterwards, we only talk about the goal, because it's from all 3 games. Here's the thing we were looking at.
yeah.
And that then is the last thing for their day as a team. That's the thing they remember the most. And, it can start to feed, but that only comes from the wider structure.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it can be something that you as a coach keep for yourself also. There might be a small part of it, like maybe your macro goal, maybe you have one on the side for yourself is I want to have good reviews from my players as being a professional coach. When they leave the team, I want them to talk positively about me. So then filter that down to your day to day. You want to turn up and be organized, and you want to be seen to be prepared and hardworking, and it informs how you conduct yourself, because that's a bigger, broader goal that you have yourself. And maybe there are those moments where you might bite your tongue a little bit when you're about to criticize an error, and you're doing it just because actually you have this identity that you're trying to build for yourself, and that attaches to a bigger goal that you have. So you can see how it informs your day-to-day decisions. So yeah, interesting to think about. There is one, not a non-negotiable. I don't really like that term, but there is a sort of non-negotiable in my own approach, which would be that another meaning of structure So I think one good practice for the day-to-day of any coach is to provide to provide structure in the sense of providing a rationale for what is going to be done. So why is that sort of structure? Well, you're providing structure to the players by saying, this is what we're going to be doing today, or maybe this is what we're going to be doing for the week, and this is why. And you are providing some structure there. You're providing some substance to it. And I think by setting people up with information about what's being done, why it's being done, giving them the expectation, like letting them know what you expect from it, and how this aligns to everyone's interest as a group and the team's mission, I think that's just really good practice as a coach. So that's like one aspect of structure and one day-to-day thing that I really think if you don't do it as a coach, you should really be trying to explain, I mean, not everything, but the broader, bigger picture decisions, like why are we working on Baron setup every Monday? Like explain why. Like provide a rationale. And if there's pushback, you need to consider it and work through it perhaps. But I think players respond to hearing a more thought out reasoning behind certain choices from the coach. So, and that can facilitate things like buy-in and stuff like that. So that's one part of structure I would more often than not want to see. Anyway.
Perfect. I think that's really, really good. I mean, it was an hour and 40 minutes on structure. Structure alone. But I think, in the grand scheme of things, that's quite a short, condensed way of approaching something. So I think it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I learned a lot from having the discussion. So
likewise, it's hard to apply it sometimes.
Yeah. That's always the fun part here is like, and the having like, okay, here's the sort of theoretical approach, and then here's the nonsense that we have to actually deal with when you're trying to do this. Okay, well, thanks everyone for watching. Next week, I'm going to be in Nottingham competing in the finals of the NLC, so won't be doing a episode next week, but we'll be back to normal on the week after. So thanks very much for watching, everyone, and yeah, see you in a couple of weeks' time.